The trouble began quietly, the kind of quiet that slips into a neighborhood without anyone noticing until it becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the community had carried a reputation of being peaceful, predictable, and carefully curated under the watchful gaze of an HOA board that insisted every mailbox, blade of grass, and driveway crack had to conform to their standards. People complained, whispered, and sometimes threatened to move, but no one really challenged them. That was the unspoken rule: you didn't fight the HOA unless you were prepared for war. For the longest time, I kept my distance from anything that might catch the board's attention. My home was clean, my yard trimmed, and my dues paid early every month. I lived quietly, almost invisibly, believing that staying out of their way meant staying out of trouble. But the illusion shattered the morning I found a bright yellow violation notice stuck to my front door like a warning from some strict, unseen overlord. The notice claimed that my side fence was aesthetic adjacent non-compliant, a phrase so vague it felt intentionally crafted to trap me. The fence had been standing strong since the day I moved into the neighborhood, solid wood, freshly sealed, regularly maintained. I knew there was nothing wrong with it. But the HOA insisted something was off, something that apparently required immediate attention and a hefty fine if ignored. At first, the situation felt like an overreach, annoying, yes, but fixable. I assumed a simple conversation would clear things up. But when I submitted a request for clarification, the board responded with an automated message implying that their inspection was final, that any attempt to dispute it would require a formal complaint process that sounded suspiciously complicated for something so minor. Still, I played along and followed the rules, hopeful that reason would prevail. Days passed without a real response. Instead of answers, I received a second notice. Then a third. Each one more aggressive than the last, escalating the fines and implying I was intentionally ignoring their demands. The tone shifted from formal to accusatory, as if they were determined to paint me as a negligent homeowner who didn't care about the community. That's when the frustration turned into determination. I began reviewing the HOA bylaws line by line, spending late nights searching for any clause that could justify their supposed violation. The deeper I dug, the more inconsistencies I found, missing signatures, outdated guidelines, and policies that didn't match the restrictions they claimed to enforce. And the strangest part? My fence wasn't listed in any section describing structural regulations. It wasn't supposed to be governed by any board approval at all. It was completely outside their authority. Suspicion settled into my mind like a heavy fog. Either the board was careless, or something bigger was happening beneath the surface, something they didn't expect anyone to discover. I decided to file an official complaint, the kind they warned would be extensive and time-consuming. The form was long, and the process was intentionally confusing, but I followed every step. I attached photos of the fence, documented maintenance records, and referenced specific HOA bylaws proving the notice was invalid. Submitting that complaint was like pushing a stone into a still pond. The ripples spread instantly. Within 2 days, the board called for an emergency meeting, something they normally scheduled only once every few months. Homeowners noticed the unusual activity, the frantic messages sent out late at night, the sudden urgency. People began asking questions, quietly at first, then louder as rumors spread that someone had challenged the enforcement system. Neighbors I barely knew approached me as I walked my dog, curious about what was happening behind the scenes. That was when something unexpected happened. Old complaints resurfaced. Neighbors who had stayed silent for years began sharing stories of strange violations, unexplained fines, and threats that never made it into official records. A pattern formed, one that pointed directly at the same few board members who now seemed oddly panicked about my complaint. Their behavior only fueled my suspicion. They tried calling me, emailing me, sending strongly worded reminders that the complaint would not only waste my time but also complicate my standing within the neighborhood. It was a thinly veiled threat pretending to be advice. I ignored it. Then, one afternoon, I received a massive document packet from the HOA, hundreds of pages of what they claimed were their supporting materials, justifying my violation. Buried inside was the mistake they probably hoped I wouldn't notice, an altered set of guidelines dated 6 months after I moved in but never legally recorded, signed, or approved according to their own procedures. It was fake. And it was the only document referencing my supposed fence violation. This was no clerical error. This was a cover-up. The realization hit hard. The board wasn't just wrong, they had intentionally created unauthorized rules and quietly enforced them for years, profiting off fines that should never have existed. If my complaint reached the State Property Oversight Office, it wouldn't just cancel my violation. It would expose everything. And that's when the retaliation began. Late-night knocks on my door. Anonymous letters warning me to drop it. Random inspections targeting my yard, driveway, and trash bins. Neighbors whispered that the board had held another secret meeting, one that seemed entirely focused on shutting me down before my complaint reached the next stage. But instead of scaring me, their desperation confirmed one thing: I was on the right path. And if they were willing to push this far to silence me, I needed to push back harder. The decision to escalate the complaint to the state office wasn't easy. I knew the fight would only get messier from here. Yet the truth was too big to ignore now, too important to let slide. The HOA had crossed a line, and my fence violation had become the spark that threatened to burn down their entire facade. By the end of the week, I prepared everything: the evidence, screenshots, documents, timestamps, and inconsistencies. I organized them into a detailed report, each page strengthening the case against the corrupt board members. I didn't know how far they would go, or what they would try next, but one thing was clear: the battle had officially begun. And once the complaint was filed, there would be no turning back. As I hit the submit button and watched the confirmation message appear on my screen, a strange mix of relief and anticipation washed over me. Something was coming. Something big. The moment the complaint reached the state property office, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. What had once been a quiet community with neatly trimmed lawns and predictable routines suddenly felt tense, unsettled, and watchful. People talked in low voices, heads turned when I walked by, and the HOA board members, usually so confident and polished, began moving like guilty shadows trying to hide from a spotlight that kept finding them. The first week after the submission was marked by silence. An unnatural quiet stretched across the cul-de-sac, like everyone was waiting for a shoe to drop. The HOA stopped sending violation notices entirely, not just to me but to everyone. The sudden restraint was suspicious, especially considering how aggressively they'd been enforcing rules just days earlier. It was as if they'd collectively frozen, hoping that doing nothing might make the investigation disappear. But silence was not safety, it was fear. Small cracks started appearing in their carefully built facade. The treasurer, who always kept a calm, superior demeanor, stopped attending morning walks with her friends. The secretary, usually the first to post reminders on the community portal, suddenly stopped making any online activity at all. And the HOA president, the one whose signature I suspected was forged on multiple documents, became nearly invisible. His car was absent from the driveway most days, and neighbors whispered that he had been attending private meetings outside the neighborhood. Despite their attempt to retreat, the consequences of their secrecy started surfacing. Homeowners who had previously ignored HOA decisions began comparing fines and violations they had received over the past year. Patterns emerged, patterns that matched the unauthorized guidelines I had uncovered in their so-called supporting packet. The more people talked, the clearer it became that my situation wasn't an isolated incident. The board had been using false rules to collect money, intimidate homeowners, and strengthen their control. My report had opened the door, and now the entire neighborhood was peering inside. As the investigation progressed, the state office reached out to me for additional information. They requested timelines, correspondence, and any records of communication with the HOA. I compiled everything with calm precision, knowing every detail mattered. That same day, I received a notification stating that the state had formally contacted the HOA board and requested all governing documents, financial ledgers, and proof of rule amendments. This was the moment the panic became unmistakable. In the days that followed, the HOA board scrambled. Without officially saying anything, they started holding private meetings in the clubhouse late at night. Lights glowed behind the frosted windows long after the neighborhood was asleep, and muffled arguments leaked into the quiet streets. From what I gathered through a few talkative neighbors, they weren't arguing about my fence, they were arguing about each other. Blame had begun to circle within the board like vultures waiting for a moment of weakness. At the same time, minor incidents started happening around my home. My trash bin was mysteriously tipped over one morning. A few plants near my fence looked like someone had stepped on them deliberately. A letter with no return address appeared in my mailbox, warning me that escalation would bring regret. I knew exactly who was behind the intimidation attempts, but they made one mistake: they underestimated how committed I was to seeing this through. What truly shifted the community dynamic, however, was the leak. Reactions exploded instantly. Comments flooded the page, homeowners demanded transparency, and screenshots circulated like sparks in a dry forest. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their courage. Homeowners came forward with stories of fines issued without explanation, approvals denied for reasons that didn't exist in any official rule, and board members showing favoritism to certain households. The trust the community once had, fragile as it was, crumbled entirely. The HOA attempted damage control by issuing a vague message calling the document misinterpreted and outdated, but no one accepted the excuse. The community had seen the truth, and now the board's authority was slipping through their fingers. A week later, the state investigator assigned to my case arrived in the neighborhood. They were quiet, methodical, and professional, asking questions, reviewing records, and interviewing residents privately. The board tried to present themselves as cooperative, but it was clear they were barely holding themselves together. Their anxiety was visible every time the investigator stepped into the clubhouse, and their desperation grew with every unanswered question they faced. One of the most telling moments came when the investigator requested the original meeting minutes where the new guidelines had supposedly been approved. The board claimed the minutes were misplaced, but the investigator asked to see the digital backups. Suddenly, the board claimed the files were corrupted. It was obvious they were improvising excuses as they went along. Meanwhile, I kept my distance physically but not emotionally. I watched the unraveling from a quiet vantage point, fully aware that the storm had only strengthened. Neighbors who had once been indifferent now greeted me with support. Some thanked me for pursuing the complaint, saying they'd never had the courage to confront the HOA. Others shared information that only helped strengthen the investigation further. But the board wasn't ready to surrender. The HOA president finally resurfaced and attempted to regain control with a bold move. They distributed a new violation notice throughout the neighborhood, this time accusing me of disturbing community harmony with false allegations. It was a desperate attempt to turn public opinion against me, but it backfired immediately. The community had seen too much to believe anything they said. The investigator, upon hearing about the retaliatory notice, added it to the growing file of misconduct. Retaliation alone was enough to warrant legal consequences. The board's position was no longer unstable, it was collapsing. In the final days of the investigation's information-gathering phase, another shocking detail emerged. Financial records suggested that the unauthorized fines collected over the past 2 years were not used for community improvements at all. Instead, they were funneled into a separate account only a few board members had access to. The moment this was discovered, the investigators' tone shifted from cautious to serious. What began as a simple fence violation had now become a potential fraud case. The board members knew it too. Their movements grew frantic, their conversations hurried and hushed. The thin veneer of control they had maintained for years was gone. They were cornered, exposed, and running out of excuses. And as the chapter drew to a close, I received a final email from the state office requesting me to be available for a formal statement. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. This was about bringing the entire HOA to justice. The day of my formal statement arrived with a strange stillness in the air, the kind that settles over a place right before something irreversible happens. The state investigator scheduled the meeting at the community clubhouse, a location chosen intentionally to ensure neutrality but also to send a subtle message: the truth would be revealed in the very room where the HOA had built its illusion of control. As I walked toward the entrance, I could sense the tension radiating from the walls. Neighbors stood in small clusters across the street, pretending to walk their dogs or check their mail, but their eyes kept drifting toward the clubhouse. They knew something significant was about to unfold, something that might change the neighborhood forever. Inside, the investigator sat at a long table with thick folders neatly arranged, each labeled and organized. Across the room, 3 of the 5 HOA board members sat stiffly, their expressions carefully rehearsed but unable to fully mask their discomfort. The president avoided eye contact entirely, staring at the carpet as though it could offer a way out. The treasurer's hands shook as she shuffled through her papers. The secretary looked exhausted, as if months of stress had finally caught up with her. My statement was simple, factual, and thorough. I described everything that had happened: the fabricated fence violation, the retaliation, the intimidation attempts, and the discovery of the unauthorized guidelines. I presented copies of documents, emails, and timestamps, each piece building another layer of truth onto the crumbling foundation the HOA board had tried so hard to keep standing. The investigator listened quietly, occasionally nodding or jotting down brief notes. When I finished, the silence lingered for a moment before they thanked me and shifted their attention to the board members. What followed was less a conversation and more a dismantling. One by one, the investigator asked the board members to explain the discrepancies in their records. The president tried to speak confidently at first, insisting that all actions taken were within the best interests of the community, but the investigator countered with hard evidence: missing signatures, conflicting dates, altered PDFs, and financial statements that revealed unusual withdrawals. The treasurer broke first. Under pressure, her explanations unraveled quickly, and she admitted that many of the guidelines were never properly approved. She claimed she thought the documentation had been finalized but couldn't verify when or how it had been created. It was a weak attempt to soften the truth, and everyone in the room could see the panic behind her shaky voice. The secretary, exhausted and defeated, confessed next. She revealed that several rule changes had been drafted privately by the president and pushed into circulation without a board vote. She admitted she had been uncomfortable with it but felt pressured into compliance. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of months, maybe years, of guilt finally spilling out. But the most damning moment came when the investigator confronted the president directly about the financial irregularities. The documents showed that thousands of dollars in fines collected from homeowners had been funneled into a separate, unofficial account. Money that should have gone to community improvements had disappeared, used for expenses the president simply couldn't explain. His silence was louder than any confession. The tension in the room grew heavy. For the first time, the board members realized there was no path out that didn't lead straight into accountability. As the investigation wrapped up, the investigator announced that the state office would be issuing a formal report within a week. The HOA board would be temporarily suspended pending the results. The accounts associated with unauthorized fines would be frozen, and all enforcement activities would halt immediately. The community would be notified of its right to vote for an entirely new board once the case concluded. Word spread through the neighborhood within hours. People gathered on sidewalks, in driveways, and even on porches, talking about what had happened. For the first time in years, the community wasn't united by fear, but by relief. The spell the HOA had cast over the neighborhood had finally broken. But the story didn't end with the suspension. Over the next several days, new information surfaced as the state office continued reviewing documents. They discovered traces of internal emails showing deliberate attempts to create fake rules. Financial audits revealed personal expenditures hidden behind vague entries. The president, once untouchable, was now facing the possibility of legal consequences far beyond a simple removal from office. As the truth came out, homeowners grew more vocal. They demanded accountability. They demanded refunds for fines that had no legal basis. They demanded transparency, something the board had never offered willingly. What had started as a lone fight over a supposed fence violation had turned into a community-wide movement for justice. Through it all, I stayed mostly silent, watching the process unfold with a quiet sense of detachment. The goal had never been to take down the board, but to defend myself against an unfair accusation. Yet the deeper I had pushed, the more corruption I had uncovered. The truth was bigger than any single violation. It was about saving the neighborhood from a system that had exploited people for years. 1 week later, the official report arrived. The state office concluded that the HOA had violated multiple regulations, including failure to document rule changes, misuse of community funds, and unlawful retaliation against homeowners who questioned their authority. The board was officially dissolved, the president removed, and the treasurer and secretary barred from holding any HOA positions in the future. All unauthorized fines collected over the past 2 years were ordered to be refunded. A special election was scheduled to rebuild the HOA from the ground up. When the results were announced, something remarkable happened. For the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, people volunteered to run for the board, not out of a desire for control, but out of a desire to protect the community. And they asked me to participate in the oversight committee, ensuring transparency for all future decisions. It was strange, stepping into a leadership role after everything that had happened, but it felt right. This wasn't about power. It was about making sure no one else would ever get bullied or threatened by the people meant to serve them. Finally, after months of tension and conflict, the neighborhood began to feel alive again. Children played in the streets without being watched by board members counting how long a bike was left on the sidewalk. Neighbors waved at each other without suspicion. Homes looked a little brighter, not because of rules, but because people were no longer living under fear. And my fence? It still stood exactly where it always had, untouched, unaltered, and perfectly compliant. The violation that was supposed to punish me had done the opposite. Instead of breaking me, it had exposed the biggest lie the HOA had been hiding for years. In the end, they tried to bury the truth. But the truth buried them instead.